Carrie.
Hi there. We are having some technical difficulties. I believe we're live right now, but people can't see or hear us at the moment because the entire live stream, which is this massive network, appears to be down.
It's a compliment, I think, that when you and I talk, they probably get very wired, Kerry.
I would imagine, but this would really be overkill. I mean, I've had all kinds of difficulties in the past, but this will be a first time we took down the entire live stream network.
Okay, we can hear both of you. Do the freaking interview.
Okay, well then, hi everyone. This is Carrie Cassidy from Project Camelot, and we are going live here. I don't know how exactly this is going to work out, but and what it tells me is that we are not live. However, we've got feedback that we are live, so we're going to go with that, and we'll record it at any rate. And may I ask that if anyone is seeing this, if they would also record it, and that way we can be sure that this will get out and be recorded in case something at my end isn't working right, which I'm not sure what's going on here. Okay. So at the moment, David, let's just bypass everything. Introduce yourself briefly with your background, if you would. And I know we kind of went through this the first day with when you were not able to be on Skype simultaneously. But let's try that, and then then we'll launch into various topics. Okay?
Yes, thank you. So, Kerry, my name is David Hawkins. I'm a 70-year-old guy, rapidly turning 71, which is by the by. I'm a graduate in mechanical engineering from Cambridge University back in the 1960s. And after leaving Cambridge with a degree in mechanical engineering and a diploma in industrial management, I joined a French oil field exploration company called Schlumberger, based out of Paris. And I had quite an exciting career, including being deployed from Paris, helping to put out oil fires, international troubleshooting. And my last job with Schlumberger was coordinator of artificial intelligence and geoscience research at the Schlumberger Doll Research Center in Ridgefield in Connecticut, where I worked on advanced problem-solving techniques where computers emulated human beings. I went back to the UK and started a software company for the international oil industry. And I was the founder. I hired the software people. And we ended up solving the data problem in the international oil industry. So all data moving between major oil companies runs on the software developed by my team. I experienced then just how savage international finances could be, because I ended up having that company and its intellectual property taken away from the original shareholders, laundered through the liquidator, and ending up with my previous employer, a company named Schlumberger, at the time when a director of Schlumberger was John Deutsch, the disgraced former director of the CIA, who was fired by Bill Clinton. And to be fired by Bill Clinton, you've got to be seriously evil, but I digress. After leaving Schlumberger and my own company in the UK, I came to British Columbia in '92. And within 3 weeks of arriving, I sensed I was in the most corrupt jurisdiction in the world, which might surprise a lot of British Columbians and Canadians. But it would appear that organized crime has got to the heart of government itself. And very interestingly, a company called McConnell and David, that I know very well, was given a contract by the United States Air Force to develop software for taking planes off their regular en route airways and clipping them into what are known as final approach procedures for Category 3C landings. Ostensibly, that was designed as an anti-hijacking technology, but I knew back then, and there was a press release of May the 3rd of 2001, that this would give the Canadian government and the investors in McConnell and David the ability to hijack aircraft electronically and provide them with a Category 3C landing, ostensibly to protect against physical hijacking of the cockpit. But in reality, of course, if you've got the bad guys operating the drag and drop interface, they can capture a plane remotely, as happened with MH370. So around December the 6th of 2006, I had been desperately trying to alert anyone who would listen to me of the dangers of what are known in the spy industry of man-in-the-middle attacks on the command structure of sovereign states, including America's. And then, fortunately, through an episode on September the 11th, I think it was 2000 and whatever, on Coast to Coast with an audience of 4 million, someone listening to me apparently knew someone that I should talk to in the United States that turned out to be Field McConnell. So around December the 6th or December the 7th, 2006, I had a telephone conversation with Field McConnell, and I think instantly, and he can speak for that himself, we knew that we had not a marriage made in heaven, we're not that way inclined, but certainly a meeting of the minds, where a Top Gun fighter pilot with some 22,000 hours of experience in large jets and fighter aircraft, and a Marine and a very credible figure met with perhaps a rather eccentric Brit with some interesting ideas about forensic economics and crime scene analysis. And we probably had an average of an hour's conversation every day since December the 6th of 2006. And that has led to some very interesting legal opportunities, including Field filing a case in the North Dakota District Court against about 100 people associated with the wrongful death of 911, and fast forward to the present, where he, as I understand it, I don't know who his contacts are, other than I believe them to include senior people in the Marine Corps Intelligence Activity Command, believe he has recently received an invitation to appear as an expert witness at one or more of the countries involved in the phony search for the debris and the last ping from the black box of MH370. That's a very rapid summary, but that brings us up to the present. Kerry, over to you.
Okay, well, very, very good summary indeed. At this moment, we have some new information that I posted to my website early this morning, and I believe you certainly would be aware of it, which is this letter from that went into the Malaysian press, from what I understand, came to me by way of Field McConnell. And it is talking about how this particular aircraft and everything that's going on with it could be very much another kind of a 911 incident, and why we have a training, what appears to be a training drill going on simultaneously with the disappearance of this airline. And that piece of information, I think, is new. I don't think anyone else has come forward to say there was a drill going on at the time this airline was disappearing.
I think you're right. It's certainly something that Field and I have been talking about right through 911 and the 7/7 underground bombing, where they use these phony drills as camouflage for hits or kidnappings, based on the fact that everyone participating in the drill in good faith is accustomed to receiving orders down through a hierarchical structure, where if you disobey the orders, in the case of the military, of course, it's a mutiny, and so the punishment is extremely serious. What, unfortunately and tragically, many people in those kind of hierarchical organizations is they're not in a position to ask that famous or infamous question, quo warranto, by whose authority? So a senior officer in the drills going on in Thailand through this hijacking of the MH370, anyone receiving an order through the drill would assume that whatever they were told to do came from an authorized source, and they might very well unwittingly participate in what is one of the most interesting, in my opinions, kidnappings the world has ever seen. Over to you.
Okay, yes, that's part of it. The other part is that we also have another relatively recent development, which is this cell phone call with a picture that was black, but nonetheless appears to be traceable to Diego Garcia, which further substantiates the idea that they are kidnapped and that the plane was redirected and steered and landed in Diego Garcia. Whether it took off again, I think we don't know. Do you want to talk about that phone call?
Yes, absolutely. And it's a fascinating anatomical exercise because this gentleman, I think from memory, his name is Philip Woods. And he has a girlfriend by the name of Sarah Bajc. I don't know if the pronunciation is right, Bajc. And somehow this woman pops up and gets an interview on BBC. So she's just one relative of one passenger allegedly on that plane. And I'm always interested when the BBC gets into the loop because I was a good friend of the former Director General of the BBC, Greg Dyke, who was Director General through 911 and the murder of Dr. Kelly. And Greg Dyke was an interesting fellow. I used to play tennis with him and I ate at his house. There was something though that always troubled me about him was his hatred for Americans, which I couldn't put my finger on why. I mean, I'd worked with Americans and I'm very fond of the country and I believe it's the great beacon of light for the world, but unfortunately is well covered by a blanket of corruption as we face it today. But so when the BBC interviews people, it pays for conspiracy theorists to look very clearly at the greatest propaganda, entertainment and news instrument the world has ever seen, which was founded in 1928. And so setting aside that particular interview with Sarah Bajc, and I'll come to that in a minute, there's a famous, and it wouldn't be described as an interview, but there's a newsreader in New York on 911 by the name of Jane Stanley. And she's being interviewed by an anchor man back in the United Kingdom on BBC about the events of that day. And it's around 5 o'clock in the afternoon of September the 11th, 2001. And she's reading a script. Actually, the more vulgar term for those kind of talking heads is they're script kiddies. That is, they have no independent volition or understanding of what they're reading. They're just being taught to read it in a way that sounds vaguely convincing to the sheeple. And so Jane Stanley reads the script, which goes something along the lines, we are getting news that the Salomon Smith Barney building has collapsed, and that is number 7. And unfortunately for her, over her left shoulder, you can see the building still standing. So the demolition team timing, and this is a vitally important part of the aspect, and the generation of the script for the script kiddies got out of synchronization. And she read a piece of script that really applied to something that was going to happen about 20 minutes later. And of course, the people watching this and watching the reaction of the audience to this extraordinary attack from a long-bearded wonder on a dialysis machine in a cave in Afghanistan with a couple of walkie-talkies, this obviously would reduce the credibility that the world's greatest military power should be brought to its knees by such a character. So they unplugged the feed. And then, of course, the BBC went through multiple gyrations to explain how this was a simple error. But that's exactly the same kind of error that took place in the communications, the real-time communications from the crime scene of MH370, and is associated, I believe, with what is technically called a limited hangout by Sarah Bajc. Now, what is this limited hangout? And this is just a hypothesis relating to the boyfriend Philip Woods and Sarah Bajc being interviewed on BBC. Well, the story from the Philip Woods and Facebook side is that this guy has a cell phone and ends up, well, he doesn't know where he's ended up, but has a bag put over his head through Facebook, he claims, by American military personnel, where the only way he was able to communicate, and he didn't know where he was, and I don't know if he understood how he was communicating the coordinates of where he was, is taking a I assume it would be an iPod rather than an iPad, out of his rectum. Now, I don't know what your sense of humor is like, Kerry, but I do find it bizarre that he should have secreted the... But who am I to judge? You know, I'm not a biologist. Anyway, he takes the iPad or iPod out of his rectum and then texts in a message to Facebook, and apparently that technology generates the GPS coordinates of where he was. So the experts were able to identify the location where he was, and it turns out to be Diego Garcia. Do you think interpreted the data as you understand it correctly? Over to you.
Yes, you have. Now, I actually have a person who's very technical who has sent me some information that I want to try to convey to you. And actually, I'm going to put it in the chat. It's crazy. But what happens is the person who extracted this data apparently went a bit further in than even what had been published, I guess, and says that that the coordinates are even more specific than was previously thought. In other words, that pinpoint exactly that this was actually broadcast from very near a runway. Originally, the information, and I'm posting this in the chat over here.
While you're doing that, let me just make a point, as I understand it. And although I am reasonably technically sophisticated in certain areas, I may have not got this perfectly right. But as I understand it, there are Google coordinates, standard Google coordinates for Diego Garcia, but the device that was transmitting the GPS coordinates showed it as something different from Google. And the expert interpretation of that is it wasn't an artifact introduced by someone spoofing it, that it was a genuine position for the iPad device that had previously been in the rectum of Philip Woods.
Right. It's the device. I mean, the coordinates on the device.
It's not an artifact.
Okay, maybe you're losing me at this point because I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Well, an artifact is something imposed by a spy or an agent who wants to
go live again. Hopefully this will work unless they've taken us off the air completely, which is, we are now live. There is a time delay, so they will be picking us up any moment now, I hope.
So do you have a new live stream link to put in the chat room?
No, it's going to be it's the same. You know, what happens is I shut everything down and I restart it using this technology that we've got going on here. Okay, now we're back. Okay, what we were saying before we were cut off, that Matt Pulver, who is working on my Blue Science and works with Paul Laviolette, has drilled in a bit deeper on the coordinates. I did post them up there for people. And by the way, we've got a very interesting person in our chat room. At least he was there earlier, and if he's still around, we may ask him to come in and chat with you a bit. His name is Bill Calder. He has a very interesting background, I believe, in special ops and other things of that nature. He's gotten very interested in this situation, so he is putting in some information on the chat, and I might want to bring him in at some point. But let's continue. So at this moment, we do have what would seem to be very good verification that they did go into Diego Garcia. That seemed extremely logical based on everything I know about black projects and underground bases. And may I say that I do have a whistleblower saying that the scientists are alive and well and quote unquote working away, as I was told. So for whatever that's worth, people that talk to me, be on off camera and so on, tell me certain things. I have to deduce whether or not the information is correct and pull things together and from various directions. That's one witness telling me that they are fine. I happen to think it's possible that the plane left Diego Garcia because it was too hot there. I mean, hot being too much. Even before this information came out, there was a lot of chatter about Diego Garcia. I believe it would have been flown to a less obvious place after that, possibly Pine Gap in Australia or another underground base in Australia. There are several. What are your thoughts?
I think probably, given the gift for what is technically known as spoliation of evidence, we can spend a lot of time focused on proving negatives or disproving negatives. So my preference is to put together an Occam's razor type of mechanical analysis, not too fanciful from a political point of view or a psychological point of view, which is what you have to do to these large chunks of metal to take them from where they think they're supposed to be going and move them out of sight and camouflage, and then choose an opportunity to get rid of them in a way that doesn't draw attention to the source of the crime scene. So I think you're right. I think it did land on Diego Garcia, Category 3C landing, instruments only. I believe it taxied into a hangar, and they have on Diego Garcia hangars, they're deployable and extendable hangars that can handle B-2 bombers, which are not so big, strato fortresses, I think they're called, which are significantly bigger. A Boeing 777-200 is bigger than either of those first two, but there's no problem about extending the canvas type deployable hangars they've got there. And then once the hangar is closed on the machine, all kinds of things can be done. The team of, and I'll come to that in a minute, of Zigbee agents that are deployed by the British and the Americans on Diego Garcia since 1966 includes amongst them psychopaths, assassins, killers, forgers, you name it, any kind of crime these people can do. So one of the things they might have done is change the livery on the aircraft from Malaysian Airlines to look like something else, maybe Israeli Air or something like that. Because remember, this is all about false flags and deception. Some people say that war is deception.
Okay, so, David, I'm very sorry to interrupt you. The people in the chat are telling me, now they're saying the sound is back. So, okay, they were telling me it was frozen. Now they say they can hear us. Can you run through that just briefly one more time, what you were saying over the last minute or so?
Okay. What I was saying was that the theory that I have would fit the Occam's razor, fitting all the facts in the maximum simplicity. So the plane lands at Diego Garcia, Category 3C landing, instruments only, Boeing uninterruptible autopilot. Pilot has no involvement, physical involvement in what happens to that plane. It taxis into a hangar, a deployable hangar, extendable so it can handle B-2s, and then the next up is the strato fortresses, and then it would be a B-777-200. Inside that hangar would be a group of agents deployed out of the United Kingdom, and I think as good a description as you can get in a very evocative term is a Zigbee agent. And a Zigbee, and that's a term from the industry, the semiconductor industry, is a stealth asset, which might be a human being with a bracelet around the ankle or a subcutaneous chip. And the only interest of the conspirators is where that particular agent is at any moment in time, let's say in the hangar, and what the function of that agent is, which might be killing, kidnapping, changing the livery on the aircraft, etc. Because once that plane is inside the hangar, all bets for the outside world are off in terms of speculation now about what might have happened to the plane, because they might have chosen to park it in the hangar, wait an hour, and then fly the high-value free-scale semiconductor team to Beijing, or they might have taken the 20 free-scale semiconductor people, expert in stealth technology, off the plane and gassed the rest of the passengers, which would be 209, unless they let out this guy Philip Woods with his iPad in his rectum, and then basically had the corpses inside the aircraft, fueled it up, and waited for an opportunity to scatter the search parties around an arc 20,000 kilometers long between Kazakhstan and the west of Australia, and wait for, let's say, about 30 days, having triggered the clock and the battery inside the black box inside that aircraft, and then started warning the public that there was a tremendous race of all the interested countries to locate the black box before the battery went dead. And then you've got this magnificent piece of theatre where the public says, or is becoming reconciled to the idea that maybe on the 30th day, some lucky ship in the southern Indian Ocean is going to get one ping, a bit like that Inmar satellite from the Rolls-Royce Trent engines, and then the battery's going to go dead, and they'll be able to say, well, we know the plane went down in the southern Indian Ocean, but unfortunately the water depth is 15,000 feet, the currents are very high, the weather's very bad, so we're calling off the search for any human beings or debris. And then you have this delightful situation. Well, I paraphrase it with Field, a bit like that famous Sherlock Holmes story associated with the dog that didn't bark, and we have now the box that didn't ping. What do you think of that, Kerry?
Well, I think it's, at this moment we're speculating, but I think that, you are in a place to be speculating intelligently at any rate. We are having still a problem. Apparently Livestream is down, and I'm kind of confused as to what is going to happen here. Everyone is complaining about the audio. They can't hear you, and the audio is not coming through. I'm trying to figure out another way to broadcast this while we're still here on the air. I've contacted Revolution Radio to see if it's possible.
Do you think it would be useful if I put in my chat, at least, that there will be this will be recorded? I mean, you have the recording capability at your end, do you?
In theory, we are recording, and this should be recording. It appears to be recording. I actually don't have any way of knowing whether it's actually working or not, because Livestream is being unpredictable.
I see.
So we're risking it. Now, at the moment, it looks like it did record the part 1, so that might mean that it's recording part 2. Mm-hmm.
Well, I hope that we can infer that this is a form of flattery if they're trying to jam the communication. But I do think, with Field in the loop, and I can always brief Field about the results of this interview, we do have what
okay,
the
now
Occam's razor...
some people are saying they can hear us again.
Oh, good.
This is really crazy. According to what I've got here, I've got a frozen screen, but I don't know.
I just see a phrase from Pat S. on my chat room. I can hear just fine through her website. Antonella else ? I don't know what that means.
Okay. Well, let's continue. We're going to continue and just plow through here. I think it's better, and then I will have a recording. It does go up on Livestream. They are recording it, so something's working behind the scenes. The recording mechanism appears to be working. What's not working is the broadcast side of things. So, so what that means is that we should have a copy, because my computer records at the same time as we are doing this. So
right,
now,
excuse me, John B. I can also hear David, so it's intermittent. I think we should just plow on.
Okay, all right. So at this moment, what I think is really important is the idea of figuring out what is the motive. In other words, what is the objective of this exercise they've gone to so much trouble to obviously do in a very, very public way. We have, for those who are new to this story, we have run down the owners of Freescale, which semiconductor, which has the 20, I believe they're 20 employees that went down with the plane, wherever it went, disappeared with the plane, I should say. And then we know the owner of that is, it all comes back to Bush Sr., and Zapata Corporation.
Can I just pop in there?
I mean, not Bush Sr., but Rothschild, actually. And Zapata Corporation is the ones that are steering the satellite imagery that Malaysia is watching and being told to follow. That's owned by Zapata, and that's owned by Bush Sr.
If I can just interject on that, and this is really complex, and I don't have a background in high finance, but one of the greatest threats to the international financial structure are entities known as private equity groups. And a classic predatory private equity group would be an outfit called Blackstone. And Blackstone is a major investor in Freescale semiconductors. And what Blackstone represents are large, I use it rather pejoratively, dumb pension fund. And when I say dumb pension fund, if I take the Fire Department of New York pension fund, which is several billions of dollars, or the Chicago firefighters pension fund, there'll be a bunch of members who go out and fight fires and do their work and discharge their responsibilities, save members of the public, and eventually retire on a pension. And then in every union or public sector pension fund, there's a group of trustees appointed to oversee the investments of that pension fund. And then they will go to organizations like the Blackstone Private Equity Group and say to Blackstone, will you please invest our pension fund money so that we can retire in comfort? And you can talk to any member of any pension fund, and without being unkind, the only thing they're interested in is the monthly check. They're not interested in what that money is being used for, including they're not interested, and I take, for example, the Fire Department of New York pension fund, that they're investing in, for example, the leverage lease on the Twin Towers, where through an insurance policy, it's possible to take out what is called a dead peasant life insurance, where the pension fund actually insures itself against the premature deaths of a significant number of its members. As on 9/11, 343 firefighters. So you've got this obscene conflict of interest where a private equity group can be manipulating a public sector pension fund to enrich insiders of the pension fund on the death of 343 members of the firefighters in New York. So when you mentioned that George Bush owned something or not, with respect, I would contradict that. I would say until we understand the role of the private equity interests in Freescale semiconductors, we will not understand the fraud that is being committed on that company and its shareholders and the United States government. So let me just take a quick synopsis of Freescale semiconductors. It has 6,000 patent families, which is huge. It provides the semiconductor and radio frequency identification technology that is the core of the concept of a Zigbee swarm of agents in special ops, for example. So the United States Navy took out a patent, and we must never, ever forget that Hillary Clinton is a patent lawyer. The United States Navy took out a patent for deployable agents and assets using precise positioning to locate them inside a building, which means that the United States Navy, through using the patent pool devices built by Freescale, can actually send in agents to a crime scene with a very specific set of functions and monitor the position of each of the agents as they move towards the criminal event, which might be the kidnapping of those people or the murder of the balance of the passengers. And from a criminal point of view, or a criminal conspiracy point of view, what you want to do, and the Navy Yard would be an example, the Aurora Theatre would be another, Sandy Hook would be another, is to make sure that your Zigbee agents are in position so that A, they can execute the crime, which might be a kidnap or a killing, and B, that that component of the Zigbees which is devoted to triage is in position before the legitimate first responders arrive. And the great power of that is, if you're a corrupt or a manipulated triage team at a crime scene, you can make sure that the expert witnesses that would normally pop up in court to reveal what really happened at the crime scene are dead on departure. And let me give you an example. In the Pentagon, US Navy Command Center on 911, there was a British company doing the upgrade, and it was being commissioned that morning, and they were engaged in what are known as sabotage vulnerability testing. That is to determine whether or not the Pentagon's US Navy Command Center was protected against the kind of attack we saw on 911. On the Pentagon lawn, before the explosion, there was a triage team. And the triage team was deployed out of the Pentagon City Sheraton Hotel that overlooks the Pentagon lawn before the bomb went off. The Sheraton Pentagon City Hotel is part of a global chain of Sheraton hotels, and another member of that chain is in Port Douglas in Queensland, in Australia. And there was a man in a room, this is an allegation, on 911, who had a clear view through backhauled images from the cameras on the roof of the Pentagon City Hotel, looking down on the crime scene before the crime happened, that is very germane to the conspiracy to the attempt to overthrow the government of the United States on 911. And the man in the Port Douglas Hotel, Sheraton Port Douglas Hotel in Queensland, was your former president, Bill Clinton. Over to you.
What you're basically saying is, if I understand, is you're looking at the background of Freescale and the shareholders. But I think what I would be curious about, and I appreciate everything you've said. I think it's very accurate and has merit. But I'm wondering if such a public incident as this one is the way they would need to handle such a thing. There has been talk that, for example, that the 20, some were from Malaysia, some were from China, and apparently just one or two Americans, that they may have had, perhaps there was something to do with the patent that Rothschild, who is the final owner of Freescale, we have traced it back. And the final owner of the company is, and I did a whole live stream on this with Mike Harris, who is a radio talk show host on rents.com. And he originally was worked at Motorola, or as a contractor and a consultant. And he actually went head to head with Rothschild to try to buy Freescale back at the time when it was a division of Motorola, seeing the merit in that company. Now, you can't avoid also the fact that that company and those employees were involved in stealth technology. Now, the flight itself was on the way to China. It appears that because the individuals were Malaysian and Chinese, that there is a very high likelihood that perhaps there was a new discovery. Perhaps there was something to do with technology that had been found, maybe even discovered at the Malaysian plant, that they then were going to fly to China and deliver to the Chinese, that the Americans did not want to see happen. Now, these are, again, speculations, but what I'm more curious at, and I understand the shareholder side of it, but that's very monetary. And this is a very... I think this is a very high-profile political event, and as we know with 9/11, there might have been some monetary payoffs in the background, but the bottom line with 9/11 was the political implications. And what it really was about was sort of getting this war on terror, this ludicrous way of starting a sort of a witch hunt for Arab type people, as well as getting this whole war on terror going so that they could finance their war machine and get the war machine going into the Middle East even more so, and get Americans supposedly behind that. And of course, we've gone into Iraq since then, and now they're in Syria, and as most people know, and I believe the next stop is Iran. So what do you have to say to all of that?
Well, that's a big run-on sentence with respect, Kerry. So let me just go back to the ownership of Freescale, and I'm just reading from Wikipedia. On September the 15th, 2006, Freescale agreed to a $17.6 billion buyout by a consortium led by Blackstone Group and its co-investors Carlyle Group, TPG Capital, and Permira. And let me just stop there. So, as I've said, the Blackstone Group is the controlling shareholder in Freescale and is today. What's important about the Blackstone Group is it owned the mortgage on building number 7 on 911 and had doubled the insurance on that building prior to its demolition. So they doubled their money. The leveraged lease on building number 7 was of a value of around $400 million, and they collected an insurance payout of $800 million. So that was pretty lucrative. So we should understand who controls the Blackstone Group. Well, it's someone that Field and I managed to bounce out of his position at the Council on Foreign Relations, because I think it was around May of 2009 or something like that, we wrote to the chairman of the Blackstone Group, whose name is Peter Peterson. And Peter Peterson is a very interesting guy because he was head of research at Bell and Howell and supplied the Zapruder camera with which Mr. Zapruder recorded the assassination of JFK. And you probably guess, Kerry, that in my life I don't believe there are any coincidences. Anyway, Blackstone, we wrote to them significantly after this acquisition of Freescale, where they control Freescale, and we wrote to Peter Peterson in his capacity of chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations. And we said, we believe that you arranged the purchase of the mortgage on building number 7 prior to doubling the insurance on the building and profiting from the demolition. And would you believe 3 weeks later he resigned from his position on the Council on Foreign Relations, which is a major position, obviously. I mean, Hillary Clinton is in that group of people.
Right.
So now what Blackstone and these private equity groups are doing, they're doing what is called patent trolling. That is to say, they look at target companies that can have the assets stripped out of them, and they have absolutely no compunction about driving companies like Freescale into bankruptcy, if that's what it takes. They certainly did that with Nortel, the Canadian company, because what is coughed up with a company that is over-leveraged, that is, it's borrowed too much money in comparison with the capital put up by its shareholders, is the lenders can manipulate the interest payments and penalties until the company can no longer afford to pay off the premium or the capital and goes bankrupt. And then, of course, it's sitting there with a pool of exceedingly valuable patents that can then be moved into a pool by the companies that historically have controlled patents since the 14th century. And those are the livery companies of the City of London. And now you mentioned the Rothschild, and this is very important, because there's a Nathaniel Rothschild who went to Oxford University and was a member of the Bullingdon Club, which is a club that dates to 1780, with David Cameron, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, George Osborne, the Treasurer or Chancellor of the United Kingdom, and Boris Johnson, the Mayor of London, all of whom were members of the Bullingdon Club. And amazingly enough, King Edward VII, when he was the Prince of Wales, was a member of the Bullingdon Club in the mid-19th century, and interestingly turned up in Washington in 1860 at the beginning of the Civil War. And the Prince of Wales, who became King Edward VIII, who became the treasonous Duke of Windsor, married to an American socialite by the name of Wallis Simpson, he was a member of the Bullingdon Club. And I don't know if you know the story, but he abdicated for the love of this woman. And after abdicating, he became, instead of King Edward VIII, he became the Duke of Windsor. And one of the first journeys he made was to Germany, where he met with Hitler and was given a tour of the concentration camps. And then swanned around Europe and various other places with Winston Churchill trying to work out whether he should have this man assassinated because he was handing over secrets to the Germans. Now, where am I going with this? All I'm saying is you're right in thinking that there's a Rothschild involvement, but I believe, with respect, you're wrong in thinking that individual members of the Rothschild family have any understanding of what's going on geostrategically. That is to say, the Blackstone Group and those kind of people have much more understanding of how the international financial community can be manipulated in such a way that individuals or corporations can be stripped of their patents, and those patents can then be pooled by these companies in the United Kingdom and turned into weapon structures that control supply chains. So, for example, the global supply chain of patents for the Honourable Company of Air Pilots is presently run out of London. And the Honourable Company of Air Pilots is in a position to put all of the decoy and drone maneuvers that we see with 911 and MH370 together. And that's what Field and I are working on. And when and if, and I believe Field will be going to meet with senior representatives of the various countries that have been sucked into this phony search routine, I believe the case that he will make to those people and their military personnel is that the global military chain of command that falls under the rubric of Defense Red Switch Network has actually been compromised by this company that Field mentioned to you in the last show, Serco, such that Serco is able to launch what is known as a man-in-the-middle attack on the chain of command of the United States that links your nominal president, Barack Obama, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to the exercises taking place in Thailand during the abduction of the Freescale personnel on that flight MH370. Over to you.
Okay, well, that's very interesting to follow that trail, and no doubt about it. I would say that there apparently is in the news, information about this Jacob Rothschild, who does get the ownership of these patents as a result of these four, I guess, employees of Freescale going missing. However, and it's logical to think of that it gets even more extensive than that, as you've just described, and goes in all kinds of directions. One, I think, needs to also keep your eye on the Carlyle Group, which is a major shareholder in Freescale, and there are others that are sort of detailed in some other articles that I've seen around here, having to do. But I am also very interested in this idea of stealth technology. In other words, the idea that a plane carrying individuals that work on stealth technology then is stealthily, supposedly disappearing, leads one to believe that there is that they may have been part of the operation, that indeed, at the very least, their technology was being used, and perhaps even a test being conducted. or something more diabolical, such as this test being done to make a statement, a political statement of a kind, to certain countries. And what the statement is not clear to me, but it occurs to me that this, as you say, I am one that doesn't believe in coincidences, and therefore there has to be something very very much of a synchronicity, having these individuals who work on this technology on this plane.
I think you're absolutely right, Kerry. And so a little rollback of the history clock, I think, is germane to this. So I've introduced, and what I rather kicking myself is I don't know why I didn't understand the implications of this network before. But about 10 days ago, while working on this analysis of Serco as a criminal organization, I put in Diego Garcia and Serco, and I found out incredibly that the British company was given the contract to upgrade the Air Force Satellite Control Network, AFSCN, the initials, on Diego Garcia and test it with the equivalent on Guam and Fort Belvoir in Washington and RAF Oakhanger, to make sure that the upgrade allowed these functions or supported the functions of the Defense Red Switch Network, again, which is a concept that I'd only heard of about 10 days ago. And the total breakdown in counterintelligence that we see associated with the Clinton regime, and that is the kind of people who look for the people who mean harm to the United States of America all the way up to an attempted coup d'etat, what I found to my horror was that these four levels, where you have the routine communications necessarily encrypted, but basically the routine that puts the politicians and the grunts and the frontline soldiers and their officers in communication with each other for any particular movement, special ops, any in the world. And then sitting above that is the immediate, which takes precedence over routine. So if you come in at the routine level, so traditionally, apparently you have a telephone keypad back in the 80s, and on the right-hand side they would be red keys, and you'd have at the bottom right R for routine, and the button above that would be I for immediate. The button above that is F for flash, and the button above that is FO, which is flash override. Now, obviously, the stuff in between is kind of irrelevant, but what's vitally important is the FO is the communication link that is set up at the request of the President of the United States and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But amazingly enough, in order to get into that FO layer or network, the President of the United States has to ask permission for the technicians that built and assemble and test the network, which turns out to be the British company Serco. So you've got this bizarre situation with, as those war games or exercises in Thailand were taking place, and I think one of them is called Cobra, Gold Cobra or something like that, but they ran through the March the 8th abduction of MH370, meaning there were thousands of United States military personnel and Thai personnel and observers, including observers from communist China, at an exercise where they would have been using the Defense Red Switch Network with those different levels of priority, from routine, immediate, to flash and flash override, or override flash, flash override. Now, this is the classic structure for what is known as a man-in-the-middle attack, and just a little bit of history there. I hope it's not a diversion. The spy master for Queen Elizabeth I was a man called Francis Walsingham, or Sir Francis Walsingham. And he managed to get Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's half-sister, locked up. and she was communicating with her Spanish and French allies with an encrypted message smuggled out in the bung of a barrel of wine, presumably going into the castle where she was incarcerated, full, and coming back empty for some more beer or more wine, whatever the poor woman needed to while away her days prior to her execution. But inside the bung of the barrel would be would be notes encrypted. I don't know what level of encryption they had in those days, but they were intercepted by Sir Francis Walsingham, and then a postscript was added, forged, that indicated that Mary Queen of Scots was plotting to have her half-sister assassinated. So all Sir Francis Walsingham needed to do was expose the communications and say, look, she's plotting to kill the Queen. So she had her head chopped off. Exactly fast forward to 9/11 and this attack, you've got a British company, which actually, if you look at its roots, goes back to the spy master of the Elizabethan era. You've got this company, Serco, that is actually forging electronically or digitally the signature, not only of the plane MH370, but the participants in the exercise in Thailand, so that mingled stealthily amongst the legitimate actors who believe they're doing an exercise to protect, I don't know, Thailand against an eventual attack by China. You've got a bunch of agents who actually have evil thoughts and evil opportunities to hijack that plane and capture Freescale's leading team. I believe there were 8 Malays and 12 Chinese in the development of the Zigbee stealth technologies that allows you to put a criminal team mingled with regular folks to do a hit or a kidnap. Over to you.
Okay, yes, and that makes sense, I have to say, in light of this new information about the drill going on, that it would sort of play out that way. The question is, then, you're now talking about, the idea here that, I mean, it is bizarre to think that these individuals would have been kept alive while the rest, we wonder what happened to the rest of the people on board. You understand? Yes. And I don't know if you've thought down that road at all. Of course, there are different scenarios that could be going on there. Any thoughts?
Well, I think the general philosophy of these, the body count is irrelevant. What they want to do is camouflage a crime. So in any group, you have high-value targets and the expendables, including the Zigbee agents who go into the crime scene, who, according to my analysis of Field's sister, she has created with Janet Reno and Jamie Gorelick in the 90s an increase in the prison population of the United States of America of around 1 million, absolutely staggering numbers, and privatized the prison system to companies like Wackenhut, which has been bought by G4S, which works with Serco. Now, what that means is those individuals who are laundered, if that's the right word, through the prison system, can be brought out on furlough or parole to do a hit in another country, and then flown back into the prison system, and they basically back in time for lunch or dinner with a nearly perfect alibi. And this is the ultimate of stealth technology. You take people, you process them either with a surgical or a chemical or a psychological lobotomy of the type practiced at St. Elizabeth's Hospital for the Insane in Washington, just across the east of the Potomac River from the Pentagon attack. And you have, in its heyday, you had 8,000 patients, a significant number. In fact, there were 100,000 lobotomies, surgical lobotomies, done at that hospital. And I'm not enough of an expert, but the product of a lobotomy, as I understand it, is a robot with various levels of functionality, but certainly not anything like approaching a normal human being, that presumably can be rewarded and punished so that it ends up, when I don't like using the word it, but basically the soul of this creature has departed. So now you've got what is nominally a human being with a brain with a very limited capacity to empathize with its victims, that you can take out of the prison or the medical hospital, deploy to a crime scene, such as Sandy Hook, to do hits. No positive feedback, given theoretically those children at Sandy Hook had up to 11 bullets in their head from an AR-15, which I don't think leaves much of a head. And basically, they're back in jail, which might be the Ghana Correctional Institute, half a mile from the school, having lunch with the perfect alibi. So we've got this hideous combination of stealth technology embedded in the military command structure of the United States of America, controlled by a British company, which is currently under investigation by the Serious Fraud Office for illegally tagging non-existent, dead, or back in jail or foreign-based prisoners, which creates a virtual force for any kind of crime that you care to imagine. Or am I digressing, or do you think that makes sense?
Okay, well, yes. I mean, I do hear what you're saying, and you're kind of referring to the individuals or the mind control, what I would call the mind control of the individuals as a form, and then the use of them as sorts of, diabolical super soldiers or something even more low
Robots.
level than that.
Zombies.
Yeah. Okay, as a kind of stealth technology. But we're also referring to a very specific software that allows for stealth technology that would allow for the plane itself to be flying, for example, for 5 hours without, even though the ping apparently was being heard, the plane itself was supposedly not seen.
I can talk to that if you wish.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, then why don't you talk to that?
Okay. So I'd like to introduce your listeners to a concept called free flight technology that was sponsored by the International Civil Aviation Organization based in Montreal. And the idea of free flight technology is to detach a plane from ground-based air traffic control with its conventional towers. So when the plane reaches its cruising altitude, which is normally not so busy as the immediate vicinity around an airport, where obviously a lot of contextual decisions have to be made by pilots based on their visual observations of what their neighbors are doing, adjacent aircraft, weather balloons, birds, etc., etc. Up at cruising altitude of the kind reached by MH370, there's not a lot of activity. And so what the people in Montreal did, and I'll come to their sponsors in a minute, which I believe is part of a criminal organization, is they said, wouldn't it be interesting if we could use adjacent aircraft to do the positioning of any one of their members at cruising altitude, so that the planes, instead of being controlled by air traffic control from the ground, are controlled by a swarm of, if you will, aerial Zigbees, each using precise synchronized timing signals and satellites and the most accurate clock in the world, which is the National Physical Laboratory clock in the custody of Serco, to position themselves. Now, when that plane had its transponders and ACARS systems switched off, it is my belief that it wasn't so much the in-mast satellite that was receiving a ping from the engines, the Rolls-Royce Trent engines of the Boeing 777-200 of MH370. It's actually the in-mast satellite was sending pings to that aircraft for that part of the Boeing that had been illegally modified to receive it. And that was what, in communications terms, is an interrogation ping, to say, where are you? And stand by for a new waypoint. And Inmarsat, I believe, is an integral part of the conspiracy for the abduction of MH370. It's a British company with some very dodgy directors, and I'll come to that in a minute. But the Inmarsat would then have pretended that it was receiving passively a ping from the engines, and then it pretended that no other satellite in that area, and the space is now swarming with satellites, both civilian and military, no other satellite received that ping, albeit they've been designed for signals intelligence to monitor everything that's communicated. And they said the only satellite to receive the last ping was the Inmar satellite in geostationary orbit directly above Diego Garcia. And therefore, they weren't able to triangulate, which is absolute garbage. So they were forced to use Doppler effect analysis, which is a phony baloney way of saying, well, when something moves towards you, blowing its whistle, it has a different frequency to when it's moving away from you. And that you can, by the different frequency, measure the speed of the vehicle. So what they said is they were able to measure the speed, but in fact, I believe they were lying. I think they were operating what effectively is a homing beacon directly above Diego Garcia and guiding the plane towards Diego Garcia in what the International Civil Aviation Organization would call free flight mode. That is to say, detached from ground traffic control or air traffic control and flown entirely by a cooperative network of aerial Zigbees. Is that clear?
Yes, and very well put together. I do want to draw people's attention. I have on the front page of Camelot and have had for a while this article by Chip Tatum that does outline who Inmarsat is owned by and where it traces back. This is the company that I was explaining, that it goes back to Harbinger Capital that used to be called Zapata Corporation, that is owned by Bush Sr. when you trace it all the way back.
Yes, and we can keep going away at those ownership situations. When I hear people quite often, we live unfortunately in a very socialized economy up here in Canada that has been taught from the mother's breast that large corporations and Americans are nasty people. Now, I worked in two large corporations. One is the Central Electricity Generating Board that at its time employed 200,000 people. And then this company, Schlumberger, which is the world leader in data technology for the oil industry. And when I hear this notion that a large corporation are psychopathic, I just look at people and shake my head, because I never met anyone, certainly from my engineering and scientific background, in either the electricity board or the Schlumberger, who didn't want to do the best they could professionally and technically and satisfy their clients. And in the case of the electricity board, the client is the people who buy electricity. Anyway, I digress. When someone tells me, and I'm not pointing at you, Kerry, that Bush owns X company, I'm saying that within a company, and I used to study corporate organizations, you have the rank and file workers who get promoted up to generally a level of executive management. And then sitting above them, you have a board of directors who are elected by the major shareholders. And in today's major corporations, the major shareholders of the institutional shareholders of major corporations are the big institutional pension fund. For example, the biggest shareholder in Boeing is the TIAA-CREF, the Teachers Insurance Annuity Association College Retirement Equity Fund, which manages the pension funds of educators such as Barack Obama and Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dawn of the Weather Terrorist Underground Organization, and Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton, who taught at Georgetown University. So TIAA-CREF was the biggest institutional shareholder in Boeing when the company was forced to move its headquarters from Washington State to Chicago, where its offices were commissioned on 911. So I'm just going off at a tangent there about ownership of major corporations. Now, if there is one director on a board of directors who can be entrapped, and we've talked about honey traps or honey pots, and there are two kinds of honey pots. There's the sexual honey pot, which I think basically everyone understands, and the smartest place to set sexual honey pots are 4-star and 5-star hotels of the kind that Bill Clinton was staying in Port Douglas in Queensland on the morning of 9/11. Now, whether Bill Clinton has been entrapped sexually, I don't know, but it's very obvious if you want to control the Bill Clinton community through the Defense Red Switch network, an obvious target would be people who are moving up the promotional ladder who might one day end up at number 10 Downing Street as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, or 24 Sussex Drive, which is the equivalent in Canada, or your 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, where whatever Obama's background is, if he can be caught in a honey trap as a young person, maybe a boy in Jakarta, or in the Lahore Hotel, you own the occupant or incumbent in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Now, when that applies to the directors of these companies, let's go to Inmarsat. One of the directors, a woman of Inmarsat, is also a director of Orbital Sciences of Dulles, Virginia. And Orbital Sciences of Dulles, Virginia is very interesting because it's the principal developer of interceptor software for incoming intercontinental ballistic missiles. So it's a vital company to provide the software that should have prevented the attack of 9/11, which theoretically was planned by a long-bearded guy in a cave in Afghanistan with a couple of walkie-talkies on a dialysis machine that brought America to its knees. And I just look at that and I shake my head and said, how in the world can Americans, who are just as bright as Canadians and Brits and Australians, imagine that they lost the most important military strategic asset in the arsenal of the United States on 9/11, and none of them, including the mainstream media, have asked the question, who replaced those key functions? Because, Kerry, you lost on the morning of 9/11, as observed, I believe, by Bill Clinton in his hotel in Port Douglas in Queensland, you lost the Pentagon's US Navy Command Center. That's the link between the President of the United States and US Navy military assets around the world, which would be the only thing that would prevent, for example, China from successfully invading Taiwan. And no American that I've met, well, a few exceptions like Phil McConnell, have said to themselves, including the military people, well, who in the world would have been able to profit, at least in the chain of command, from the removal of the US Navy Command Center and its transfer to X? Well, I believe I know who it was transferred to. And it was transferred to the livery companies of the City of London, in particular the Honourable Company of Master Mariners. But perhaps, that's a digression. But we're not asked. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, that's fine. And well, that's very interesting. And I'm not surprised by that sort of trail. But yeah, and all of what you say is very logical. I can say that following out those trails through the company, owners, the stockholders, the major stockholders, et cetera, obviously you're getting into a level of detail that few people do, but one cannot either sort of avoid the sort of links to the CIA and also to Bush Sr. that were indicated as part of Inmarsat and what is, Zapata Corporation, what became Harbinger either. So,
right.
I think that these things are in addition to rather than either or. But
Yes.
but certainly these are important points. There are reasons that you can trace some of the other false flags. I believe Sandy Hook is one of them, that I ran down with a remote viewer, who I shall not name, that indicate that the City of London also was involved in that, and that there was some very strong symbolism indicating that there were some banking maneuvers going on associated with Sandy Hook that most people don't follow out, but were shown to me, that I found very fascinating, and so on. So there does seem to be, even in the Boston bombing, apparently some symbolism behind the scenes that has to do with, when we say City of London, I think in terms of the Rothschild New World Order, because what we have is our factions, as I understand it, and you can certainly weigh in on this, which have to do with Bush Sr. running a cabal that tries to be in charge of the United States, while the Rothschild side of the New World Order, and they have a sort of competition between them as to who's going to run what. And this is where some of the symbolism of these false flags, it comes out in these kinds of maneuvers that have to do with the City of London trying to take over things and control of America, or in essence bring America back under its fold. What I've been told is that in order for the New World Order to succeed, at least as it's envisioned by the Rothschild side of things, that that America has to be taken down, and that includes financially. And so this is where Bush Sr. and Rothschilds are often working at cross purposes, even though their ultimate aim is the same thing, which is a New World Order. But I guess, from what I understand, it depends who's going to run that New World Order. Thoughts?
Well, yeah, and I can't apologize for the complexity here, because there's hundreds of years of history intertwined where powerful organizations, and let me just identify one extraordinarily powerful organization, the British East India Company, or the Honourable Company, British East India Company, in its time, and its chartered papers in 1600 from 1601 from Queen Elizabeth I, was the most powerful corporation, given inflation, that the world has ever seen. It had ships, the fastest ships, faster than the Royal Navy, better armed than the Royal Navy, and it had, in the 19th century, 200,000 men under arms. And Queen Victoria tried to dismantle it and take its assets and basically share them out amongst what we would now recognize as Her Majesty's forces, armed forces. And the sappers and miners of the British East India Company were absorbed into the regular British Army. And that company was given the right to trade into China and India, tea mainly in China, and tea mainly in India, and opium in China. And its descendants, if you will, and these are the very powerful families that include the Rothschilds and the Astors, as in the Waldorf Astoria in New York. These people, they're basically built their wealth on the opium trade. And they were in a powerful enough position, actually, to finance the opium wars of the 19th century. In the 19th century, the Port of London would sometimes have as many as 20,000 ships. That is, it was the hub of world trade. In the 20th century, the powers that be, these very powerful livery companies, and there's 109 today, the latest one being the Worshipful Company of Educators, which would be affiliated to people like Obama and his wife, and the leaders of the weather terrorist underground organization, Bernardine Dawn and Bill Ayers, who are the mentors of Obama. These people basically now control the supply chains of the 109 livery companies, one of which is the Honourable Company of Air Pilots. that just changed its name. But the Honourable Company of Air Pilots has been intimately involved with all major weapons development that are delivered by air, including the technology of free flight that was used to disappear MH370 as it reached cruising altitude and linked up at that waypoint north of Malaysia with the Singapore Airlines 68, and then flew on an hourly homing interrogation ping from the Inmarsat satellite until it was over Diego Garcia, where the SIA 68 continued on to Portugal, and MH370 was peeled off for its Category 3 sea landing on the Boeing uninterruptible autopilot and landed on the island where the plane was refueled. And my theory is, during the next 72 hours, and it's very interesting because our research team has discovered that on the 8th of March of 2014, when the plane was disappeared, for the next 72 hours, the departures from Diego Garcia were shut down. Now, isn't that interesting? Because now, when it says on the Facebook that there's a 72-hour shutdown of aircraft departing, that doesn't prove that no aircraft left in that next 72 hours. So on the hypothesis side, it is my belief that the 20 experts in Zigbee stealth technology with free-scale semiconductors were flown to their original destination in Beijing and probably didn't meet with this individual, and I'll come to that individual in a minute. I think they would probably have been taken to the Tianjin fabrication plant for free-scale semiconductors that Kerry was set up in 1992. So I, as a Brit, with no particular professional background in counterintelligence, would say, why would you have a company that's on the cutting edge for decades on the development of stealth semiconductor technology of the kind needed by the B-2 stealth bomber? Why would you set up a fabrication plant in Tianjin in China, which is run by the People's Liberation Army? And then I thought
Actually, I want to just stop you there because, yes, I mean, this is perplexing, and this is part of what I discussed with Mike Harris, who knows and was present during the time when Motorola was sold off to China, or at least a good portion of it, and that it was in essence taken down, and he talks about that at length. So I just want to interject that there is something going on with that. What it is, I do not understand. It's not clear to me. So if you can make that clear.
Well, I think I can. So going back to the British East India Company, the most powerful company the world has ever seen, given its time period, basically Queen Victoria and her advisors tried to dismantle it. But it's a bit like after the Second World War, dismantling the operation of the Nazis with British intelligence and American intelligence in bringing, through Operation Paperclip, camp commandants from the concentration camps and leading German rocket scientists into the United States to form the basis of the CIA. It's exceedingly difficult to dismantle these networks, whether they're corrupt or not, because the network, by its very nature, is invisible, and its ties and internal obligations and responsibilities are beyond the ken of the average person in the street. They didn't know it ever existed, let alone it's continued to exist. So let me just go back to the fabrication plant in China. So my thesis would be, when the British East India Company, albeit Queen Victoria had attempted to dissolve it, was running the opium trade into China, the great British fortunes and associated American fortunes were built on the opium trade by the number one drug dealing, trafficking and money laundering bank in the world, which is the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank Corporation, which about a year ago paid $1.9 billion fine to Christine Marcy Field Sisters Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture Fund to keep its directors out of jail or to be treated as members of a racketeering, influenced and corrupt organization in respect of money laundering through the Mexican drug cartels. So between 1865 in London, at the height of the opium trade, and the payment of the fine within this last year of $1.9 billion to Christine Marcy's fund, I ask you, what's changed? I mean, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank Corporation, unlike the people, the tellers, who I'm sure are thoroughly reliable and decent people, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank chartered an armored personnel carrier to move the banknotes across the border into Mexico to pay off the Mexican drug cartels that have got a nasty habit of decapitating people in large numbers or hanging them off bridges. So the problem is with this stealth technology, and I'm coming to it, if I'm right in saying that the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank Corporation has continued to engage in arms and drug and white slave traffic and can stay out of jail by paying protection money to Christine Marcy's Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture Fund, why wouldn't it finance the development of a stealth technology fabrication plant in Tianjin for the People's Liberation Army, where, because there's a limited number of people who can reverse engineer these kind of semiconductors, they needed a complete team. And it's unheard of, because I used to fly at a fairly high level in Schlumberger on a plane, and in Schlumberger you never put more than 2 or 3 high-value people on the same plane, for obvious reasons. Why would Freescale have put 20 of these very high-value people on the same plane? And did they know that each other was on, because it would be easy to book them independently, and you don't necessarily talk to someone 3 rows behind in a second seat. It's only perhaps when you arrive on Diego Garcia and various people are selected out of that 229 passenger load, and you find out that 20 of your colleagues in this patent technology stealth world had all been abducted together. So it's not at all obvious they knew they were going together as a delegation, and that would be a characteristic of a Zigbee kidnapping, that you don't tell everyone exactly what you're doing. Anyway, going back to the fabrication plant. Now, what I believe we can now prove at Abel Danger is that the defense red switch network that operates between the routine, immediate flash and flash override protocols has been compromised by the British company Serco. That is to say, when people in the chain of command, like the 2 platoons associated with the assassination of Pat Tillman, when they receive a command through this defense red switch network, the officers and men and women receiving the command believe that it's coming from a legitimate source because it's coming through an encrypted network. What they don't realize is that that network has been compromised by Serco, and it can, either in the name or with efficient actors, mimic the voice of none other than Barry Soetoro or Barack Obama. Now, how would, if I'm the officer of a platoon that's been split up from another platoon in Afghanistan, and I've got one of the Tillman brothers in one of the platoons and another in another, Pat Tillman, and suddenly platoon 1 is sent off on the road to Khost, and platoon 2 goes into a canyon to clean out a Taliban nest in a village, and then for some amazing reason, the platoon that's carrying a helicopter that's broken down or something like that turns around, comes back into the canyon, and the 2 platoons start shooting at each other, and someone puts a short burst 3 bullets into the forehead of Pat Tillman, which wouldn't leave much of his head. That was a hit. And it was a hit organized by compromising the defense red switch network, which links the entire United States command structure with its allies around the world, including the United Kingdom, including Canada, including Malaysia, and including Thailand, as per the exercise. So,
Okay, but
go ahead.
yeah, and I appreciate all of that. The only thing is, I'm still back at this plant in China,
Okay.
and I'm
All right.
still trying to kind of put that piece in its place.
Okay,
And
let me give you a very important clue. In
okay,
December of 1997, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who would be a principal player at the flash override level of the Defense Red Switch Network, his name was John Shalikashvili. He was the son of Dmitry Shalikashvili, who was a major in the Waffen SS in the Second World War, who lied about his past to get into the United States. John Shalikashvili arrives in the United States and is educated in Illinois and gets promoted, I believe, by British intelligence to the point where he becomes the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, reporting to the chief the commander-in-chief, Bill Clinton. Unbelievably, in 1997, Bill Clinton sends the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, John Shalikashvili, to Beijing to give a presentation to the People's Liberation Army University in Beijing. And from memory, excuse me if I don't get the words exactly right, at the end of that presentation, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff says to the audience, presumably of the highest ranking generals in the People's Liberation Army, my president has instructed me before leaving here to leave details with you of all America's weapons programs. Now, I don't know what you think about that, but I'm a Brit, and if I sensed, and I have relatives in the British Army, when such an individual, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, having said that, and its public statement, came back to the United States, I believe he and his president of the time should have been arrested and put in front of a military tribunal, because that's treason. Thousands of American soldiers have died as a result of the transfer of technology by the Clintons and the late John Shalikashvili to the Communist People's Liberation Army in Beijing.
yes, okay,
And one of the things that was created in part of that environment is the transfer of the patent technologies related to stealth bombing that has gone to the fabrication plant in Tianjin province.
okay. So, yes, and I'm aware of that past with the Clintons, and that has been bothering me, and in association with this actually. But I see where you're going. I mean, this is very fascinating, and I want to know, again, sort of, why. In other words, what is the purpose of this link up with a supposed sort of certainly an enemy on some level, and I understand on the highest level that these people work together, okay. But but on this lower level that we're talking about here, it does seem to be contradiction, and and I've had. I mean, there's other information out there with things in sort of. I think the harbor in Southern California being sold off, lots of land, lots of important land being sold off to the Chinese. Buildings and things of that nature. In other words, there does seem to be a steady, I don't know, encroachment by the Chinese in America, and I'm trying to figure out what we're talking about here.
Well, let me back up to this role that the United Kingdom has had in the development of China, and communist China specifically. And remember, the first communist, at least the theoretical communist, would be Karl Marx, who was groomed and trained and employed and hired and rewarded in the United Kingdom. So the Communist Manifesto of 1848, it's got some extraordinary lines in it. One of them is confiscate the property of your enemies. Another, not in the Communist Manifesto, is a statement by Karl Marx, abolish the family. Even the most radical flare up the infamous suggestion of the communists. So what you see in the communist, which I believe was entirely orchestrated out of the United Kingdom as an action-reaction problem type thing,
Right.
is that they could create this monster of communism and give it a name, a bit like Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and then say the free world has to arm and prepare for an attack by the communists. But there's a deeper bond, I mean, and this would be my theory, and it comes back to this idea of if you can take a human being and either surgically, chemically, or psychologically lobotomize them at any level, that is to say, the psychological lobotomy might be the entrapment of a Bill Clinton or a Hillary Clinton at a young age when hormones are raging, to the extent that it is my understanding that while on a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford University, Bill Clinton was kicked out of the university for rape in 1969. Now, your readers and researchers are welcome to check that, but my understanding is after being kicked out of Oxford, and I think also there was allegations of drug dealing, Clinton didn't come back to the United States, he went to Moscow. And in Moscow, he met with senior people from the KGB, and apparently they discussed, amongst other things, how much information could be pumped out of John McCain at the Hanoi Hilton in Vietnam. So coming back to, is there, and I suppose I put that just out there as a question, I think it's almost rhetorical, is there a mechanism by which the average human being, male or female, can be entrapped sexually at an early enough age such that they would rather die than risk exposure of the evidence of what they did, let's say hypothetically, to a child? And alarmingly, I'm afraid, there are organizations around the world, including SOS Children's Villages, which is, I believe, in 143 countries, and the Angel Tree Network associated with the Prison Fellowship Program, where the children associated with orphans during civil wars, incredible cruelties and genocides, where the children are witnessed something almost beyond imagination being done to their parents, and then they're captured, turned into child soldiers, run through camps and processed. And at the end of that time, eventually they become teenagers, and then they become regular people in society, but with a past that perhaps they'd rather die than have revealed. Now, is someone like Hillary Clinton or Bill Clinton or Barack Obama or Michelle Obama, and I'm going to come to a very important trip that Michelle Obama made recently, are they immune to that kind of entrapment and blackmail and extortion? And the answer, I think, is no. Now, going back to the Tianjin fabrication plant, Michelle Obama is an intellectual property lawyer, and she worked from 1988 to 1991 at the law firm of Sidley Austin in Chicago, whose clients include Airbus, the great competitor to Boeing, of course. And her mentor at Sidley Austin was a woman by the name of Bernardine Dawn, who's a psychopath, the leader of the Weather Underground organization. And she was employed, Bernardine Dawn, for 4 years by Sidley Austin to groom women interns. Now, you're a woman, Kerry. I don't know if you can imagine what grooming by Bernardine Dawn would be like, but I think it would test your moral fortitude. Because from 1984 to 1988, it would appear that Bernardine Dawn, the psychopath, the woman who arranged the bombing of the Pentagon in 1972, had access to the bright young women that came to a very illustrious law firm, and would have been in a position to entrap them, I believe, in situations where subsequently, whatever careers they followed, they were controlled by the groomers and the entrapment specialists in Chicago. Now, Michelle Obama in 1991 goes to Washington with a team of Sidley Austin lawyers representing three clients. One is Union Carbide in the aftermath of the sabotage of the Bhopal plant, where 47 tons of water was pumped into a bath of methyl isocyanate, killed 8,000 people in that area and seriously injured 270,000. And the first tort lawyer to arrive to adjust the claims was a Sidley Austin lawyer called Sir Ian Percival, but I digress. Another client was AT&T, which built the original technology for the Defence Red Switch network for continuity of government. And the other outfit was PBS, Public Broadcasting, which does the propaganda, as I see it, for the BBC. Fast forward to the aftermath of the disappearance of MH370. Lo and behold, the Sidley Austin intellectual property lawyer, who was disbarred, as I understand it, in 91 or 92, books in with her mother and her friends and cronies and the two girls into the Westin Hotel in Beijing, which was the destination for the Freescale Semiconductor team prior to going on to wherever they were going to. And apparently the Chinese staff of the Westin Hotel, which is run by the Starwood Group, which also ran the Pentagon City Hotel and the hotel in Queensland where Bill Clinton was on the morning of 9/11, the Starwood Hotel Westin chain housed this woman and her cronies, and apparently the staff in that hotel were going around the bend because the woman, I don't know how that quite translates into American, she's got no class. And her mother has even less. So they were shouting at the staff, they were embarrassing themselves, they were making unreasonable demands, and they were acting according to, I guess, type, if you will. But the interesting thing for me is you've got Sidley Austin lawyer, specializes in intellectual property, with a very interesting challenge for the United States of America and Communist China, which is what to do with the intellectual property associated with the disappearing team of Freescale Semiconductors and the reverse engineering going on in the Tianjin fabrication plant. And I suggest to you that Michelle Obama was negotiating a trade-off. The denouement, I don't know what it is, but I think it's going to be pretty shattering for world history. I believe that Michelle Obama was acting unlawfully in negotiating with the highest level in the Chinese People's Liberation Army on an exchange of technologies that will one day lead to the potential for a stealth attack on the United States of America with Chinese weapons. Over to you.
Okay, well, yeah, that does make sense, as you have outlined it. I can say, though, that it actually sounds, because you're making it as though, in a sense, they're dealing with a disappearance of a plane that they are actually orchestrating. So her being there to negotiate wasn't an accident. Obviously, it would have been planned. Yes. And it would also indicate that, not sure, but the way you're sort of painting this picture is that these individuals, these 20 scientists in essence, are probably dead, at least from the point of view of the way, this negotiation would have taken place, in theory. But
I think I would say there would be a catch-22. I would say the 20 scientists are dead for all intents and purposes in the public view, okay. But I believe they may still be alive and converted, perhaps given new identities, to work at that fabrication plant on reverse engineering the Freescale Semiconductor chips. Over to you.
Okay, yeah, because that's the only thing that sort of remains. Now, there is another, and thank you for all of that. And your researchers and your research is really stellar. And I appreciate you taking all the time to go through all of that. And I believe it's being recorded very well here, in spite of the intermittent in and out of the audio for the public. We will get this out there regardless. But the question I have is something nobody seems to be talking about, but I'm curious about. What about the other passengers? Has anyone looked at that list and found anyone else of special note besides these scientists that everyone has already pinpointed? And have any of your researchers gone down that road? Because it is possible that there are some other players in this game that were part of, the team on board.
I think, that's a very interesting observation, Kerry, because it comes back to this dog that didn't bark. I mean, why haven't they published the names of the 229 passengers so that the public at large, I think it was Thomas Jefferson said, an informed public will make the right decision. I can't answer that. I don't know who the 209 passengers, other than apparently this guy, Philip Woods, who's an IBM, I don't know if he's an executive or a manager or a technical guy, the fellow who takes the iPad out of his rectum. Most amazing character, I think. But the other 208 at the moment, for the public at large, are apparently anonymous. The entire focus is that woman, Sarah B. Badge, who's the girlfriend of Philip Woods, said, we think we're being misled, but she didn't actually pursue that. But what I found bizarre about that BBC interview with her, if on the Facebook, this guy, her boyfriend, says, I took the da-da-da and etc., she doesn't mention that. She just claims to be the girlfriend of the man, and she really believes that it's the governments are playing with the people's minds, but she doesn't pursue it. So I think that's a very valid question. Why wouldn't they publish it? Well, maybe there are some extremely high valuable people on the other 209, and they're terrified that those individuals, once their names are published, would reveal some of the things that I believe the 20 free-scale people do, that it actually leads back to the compromising of the most important strategic asset in the arsenal of the United States of America and its allies, which is the defense red switch network. Over to you.
Okay, well, you're saying the compromising of that, but there's also the stealth technology itself, which seems to be part of this scenario that is going to be compromised.
Yes, let me just say that. So we don't know what those 20 people had in their hand luggage. Remember, these semiconductor devices are tiny. To both fabricate them, design them and fabricate them, you need an extraordinary specialized technology, immensely expensive. And to reverse engineer them, I believe you need some extremely powerful technology, and I presume that that's in the fabrication plant in Tianjin.
Well,
but the actual size of the device to be stolen, you could actually insert as a subcutaneous chip in the skin of the web of your hand.
Okay, but there's another part to this story that involves another part of the technology that had just been in the news, apparently. That Freescale Semiconductor had just sort of created this chip, and because I'm not very technical, I don't quite know how to phrase this, so I might be getting this wrong. But my understanding of what I heard and what I read is that the chip that they had just patented and put out there, basically, is a chip that is sort of like a centralizing chip, if I understand this correctly, that is able to operate all sorts of other chips and devices. In other words, are you familiar with that aspect of the story?
You know what? I'm actually looking at the name of the chip, and it's called Kinetis, Kinetis, and this isn't my immediate area, except that I've had a general background in science and technology and artificial intelligence, so I think I understand what they're going. But let me just, may I read it? It's a rather technical description, but anyway, I'll do my best. On the 26th of February 2013, Freescale Semiconductor announced the creation of the world's smallest, in brackets by size, ARM-powered chip, the Kinetis KLO2, and very interestingly, Kerry, KL stands for Kuala Lumpur, because that's where it was designed, apparently. KLO2 measures 1.9 by 2 millimeters, so it's tiny, and is a full microcontroller unit, MCU, meaning the chip sports a processor, RAM, ROM, clock, and I/O control unit. One application that Freescale says the chips could be used for is swallowable computers. Freescale already works with a variety of health and wellness customers. The new chip was on display at Embedded World in Nuremberg, Germany from February 26th to 28th, 2013. Now,
okay,
my interpretation...
let me just stop you right there, because I am also looking at an article, but you've got the year wrong. It was February, you've got the date right, but it was 2014.
Okay, well, it says on the Wikipedia it's 2013, so maybe that's a Wikipedia mistake.
Yeah, I'm looking at CNET, a CNET article, and they're very computer literate over at CNET, so I would be very surprised if this information was wrong, according to this at least. Okay,
but you see, and I have years in product development in various spheres, when they announce the release of a particular item, it will have been debugged, it will have been modified. Its antecedents, including the patent devices that are integral to this new launch, will go back years, if not decades.
Sure.
So the important thing about Freescale Semiconductors, in being able to produce this extraordinary piece of technology, the technologies that would have been required as precursors were already in place and already being used and already being manufactured. So it's not a sudden discontinuous appearance where they suddenly put on a hijacking, if you will, to get the employees that are a principal part of it. Now, where I'm going with that is what I've described there is the very core, and used it as a sort of central management function. This is the essence of Zigbee precise positioning of assets which might be human or they might be weapons. Let's say a dirty nuke, a suitcase nuke, right, could have one of these chips attached to it, right, in the briefcase, meaning that everyone with access to that defense red switch network at the appropriate level would know exactly where the dirty nuke was, whether it was in Chicago Hotel or the Astoria, Waldorf Astoria in New York, or in the Westin Hotel in Beijing in the baggage of Michelle Obama. Now, from the point of view of the geostrategic level here, is what we're dealing with, I believe, Kerry, is a racketeering, influenced and criminal organization. It's not terrorist, it's not Satanist, it's not Illuminati, it's Jews. It's a criminal organization that we give too much credit for when we say they're terrorists. Because what we're implying there, yes, of course they're terrifying, but we're implying that there are organizations that just exist in this loosely defined umbrella of terrorism, which you can attach the name Al-Qaeda or the Taliban and then spook the American public into looking for terrorists under the bed, if you will, instead of using the law that already exists in the United States of treating these kind of structures as racketeering, influenced and corrupt organization, where membership is a crime. And so you don't have to prove that these individuals killed someone. All you need to do is prove that they are members of a racketeering, influenced and corrupt organization. And if the RICO actually killed people, you throw the members into jail for murder for hire. So where am I going with that? What I guess I'm basically saying is that people equipped with these kind of technologies can bring stealthily a portfolio of weapons into the gates, inside the gates of Washington, D.C., and say to the senators and the congressmen, we have weapons that involve, for example, a sabotage spore powder with anthrax bacteria. So you've got these little senators and congressmen. I don't mean in a pejorative or patronizing sense. You've got people who maybe had a job working in a union as a secretary, who've been elected and been sent to Washington to represent their constituents' interest, and they sit as congressmen or senators and maybe even graduate into the White House. But they have absolutely no structure and training to deal with the kind of second-based decision-making as should we concede something over here in order to avoid having a dirty nuke attack in Washington, D.C. And if you look at people like Obama, and I'm not saying that I or you would be any the better, it's so much out of our experience. All the conspirators or the crime groups need to do is to say meaningfully and credibly, we can attack you with letters containing anthrax. Now, what do? Do you roll over? You don't know who your attackers are. You do know that suddenly, in spite of the billions of dollars of counterintelligence and technology, you've got letters with anthrax powders arriving through the United States Post Office and killing people. So I believe what we've got here is an organization engaged in extortion and intimidation using modern technologies where they've literally captured private companies owned by shareholders and converted their patents and intellectual property into weapons that they can store and conceal and camouflage and use to threaten and obtain concessions from the public at large anytime, anywhere, including a Boeing 777-200 that was captured from Malaysian Airlines. Over to you.
Okay. Yes. Very well said. I'm actually still looking at this little processor, which is it was released, or at least the news was released, the 25th of February, and what it was is that this particular thing was. It's called the Kinetis KLO3 MCU. It's 15% smaller than its predecessor and 35% smaller than the competitive offerings, according to the Freescale people, and is supposed to be about the size of a dimple in a golf ball, is how it's described. But it is a microcontroller, and it seems to me that this release that was, I guess, very public, because it's all over the internet. You know, you just start a search and you see article after article. What it appears is that again, if you don't believe in coincidences, the date of that release and the date of this happening are so close together that that it would appear there's something going on with that. In other words, I agree. That we can't ignore that either. So, I appreciate what you're saying about the extortion side of things. I'm not sure. I think that for example, the artificial intelligence, which this really hints at being a kind of almost a nanotech controller of sorts. They call it a microcontroller. Meaning, what does it control? It can control, who knows? I mean, I'm again not that technical, but I can see that the possibilities could be extensive. And what you've got there is a technology that you really wouldn't want to share with your enemy, I don't think, if you have an enemy, and that you might want to bargain for on other levels, and certainly might be worth taking over a plane of people to waylay it or send it in a different direction with a purpose in mind.
And sending the First Lady to the Westin Hotel in Beijing to negotiate with the leaders of the People's Liberation Army on whatever transfer is appropriate.
Yeah, and I think that's also a key piece that I don't think anyone else has brought up. Kudos to you and your team for even picking up on that. I haven't seen one item about the synchronicity, which again is there are no coincidences of her being there, located there with her background. And I'm sure there are other ones that maybe we haven't heard about yet. So we've been going for quite a while here, and I think that we should stop this because I'm afraid that some of this, or maybe even all of it, is not being broadcast. Now I'm going to ask the chat here if they can reply as to whether or not any of this has been getting through at the moment, because then the next step here would be to, and certainly allowing you to decide if there was anything else you wanted to add, but would be to take questions from the audience for the next few minutes, if you wouldn't mind, if we can do that, and it's at all possible, and it looks like it should be. They're telling me the last half hour was good.
Oh, good.
But I have to say we are recording very well here. So if there are questions from the audience, would you mind addressing those?
No, I'd be
briefly?
delighted.
Okay, and was there any wrap-up comments that you wanted to make?
Yes, I do think it's very important, and I'm amazed at this KL02 or 03 or whatever it is, that you can swallow it, and it's got this millimeter dimension. And you point out, well, perhaps you're implying the question, how can this be used? Well, if I can get a group of people, as Serco and G4S have, where historically they've been illegally tagging, that is with an ankle bracelet, prisoners who don't exist, who are dead or back in jail or they're overseas. Well, now apparently the technology has been miniaturized, so I could either get them to swallow it or insert it in the web of their finger as an RFID device. And what that would allow me to do, if I have evil intent, is to get a team of these people at the Kuala Lumpur airport or the Kuala Lumpur hotel where these people checked in before they were going off to Beijing. Similarly in Beijing, similarly on Diego Garcia, and then in the virtual war room, which is in the cloud somewhere, you can actually in real time see the location of your target. Let's say those are the 20 people that may or may not have been implanted with this little chip, and see where your guys are, that is the bad guys, and see how close the good guys are, and see if you can get away. You see, the power of this technology is you don't have to make a decision whether or not to proceed with the abduction of the team on that plane until you're confident that you've got all your bases covered at both ends, both in Kuala Lumpur, in Beijing, and in Diego Garcia, which would be consistent with them shutting down the departure of aircraft for the next 72 hours on the 8th of March of 2014. So I think this is absolutely core technology to stealth and the deployment of ZigBee agents for anything from sabotage and assassination and intimidation and extortion. So I'd love to answer any questions if there are any.
Okay, and we are getting some positive responses here that the sound has been good for the last 30 minutes, and even some people are saying the last hour, which is quite hopeful. But at any rate, this will be broadcast. It would go automatically onto live stream, and it will go onto YouTube later today or tomorrow morning, depending on how long it takes me to get it exported. But I would ask if anyone has questions in the chat to put your questions in all caps, and a bad timing because we've got the other one saved and it will crop up very quickly here. So we're going to be back on the air, and I think we should be showing up over there now. So we can take questions. We have saved what we just recorded, and it should be cropping up on live stream. If you refresh your page, you'll see it show up at the bottom underneath the screen very shortly. So once again, if you have questions, type them in all caps and do it quickly so that we can take the questions that you might have. And some people are saying this is frozen still, and that means that they're interfering with the broadcast again. But I can see that there is some movement, so it looks like maybe it's starting up again. And someone's asking, have you been to Malaysia before?
David Hawkins?
Yes.
I've worked in that area, Papua New Guinea and Indonesia, but I don't think I've been to Malaysia.
Okay. Anyone else with questions, please type them again in caps as quickly as possible, and I will endeavor to ask them of David as we have this brief time here. Okay, some people are saying there's no audio. I don't know if there is or there isn't. Somebody says it's okay now. Again, we are basically hanging on here now to extend this broadcast simply to allow the public to ask questions. So if you do have questions, please do put them in the chat right away. And we will stand by here. In the meanwhile, is there any other thoughts that you had, or maybe talking about the future and what investigations you're doing? What might be some next steps that we might go through here? Because we know about the letter that was published, and we began this conversation by talking about briefly, but the idea that this is all of this happened during a drill. Interestingly enough, we had talked about with Field O'Connell at the very end this Operation Capstone, which is another drill happening here in America that started actually the day we were broadcasting with Field, which was the 27th, I believe, of March, and is going to the end of April. It involves, at least in the beginning, supposedly Alaska, some kind of preparedness for a large Alaskan earthquake, and then continues to deal with something that seems completely unrelated to an earthquake, which is so-called cyber terrorism, coming from people that are anti-government. That would include me, I imagine, and maybe yourself, depending on how you want to categorize this kind of thing, depending on the Patriot Act, etc. So that is another drill, and whenever I don't know about you, but whenever we hear there's going to be a drill, then we immediately think a false flag is in the works. So with that in mind,
perhaps I could comment on that, Kerry.
Yes, please.
The British in the Second World War, with their American counterparts, and the Canadian William Stephenson in New York, and Churchill, they developed what was known as a continuity of government protocol. That is to say, if the Germans had invaded the United Kingdom with its old tradition of empire and commonwealth and so on which the sun never set, probably there are a few countries in the world that could do it. They could transfer functions nominally carried out by a central government in London to the colonies. Now, in the greater scheme of things, of course, in 1776, the Americans, the 13 colonies, won their independence, but they didn't rupture the things like the loan structure, where the City of London had lent substantial sums of money to the colonies to develop infrastructure. And in my opinion, they didn't cancel the debt. So I think there are people, rightly or wrongly, in the United Kingdom who still believe, so to speak, they own America. Now, what's the future hold for us? Well, if Churchill's continuity of government protocols were never dismantled after the Second World War, but in fact were amplified and adjusted to reflect the technologies that you and I have just been discussing, the question to be asked of the American citizen, are they aware of what the continuity of government protocols look like today in the event of a follow-up to 9/11 or a dirty nuke in Chicago or Washington or New York? And in order for those people, the average citizen, to answer that question, I and Field, and I think my colleagues in Abel Danger, believe we have a responsibility to try and explain what might at one level appear the inexplicable, the function of this defense red switch network in terms of continuity of government protocols. So, for example, on 9/11, Richard Clarke, the cyber war terrorist chief in the White House or in Washington, engaged the continuity of government protocols associated with an all-out attack on the government. And I think this is a clear demonstration of evil intent behind this red switch network, because the red switch network at the highest level is called flash override. That would allow the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the President of the United States to override all the communications beneath and make a decision which the inline commanders would have to follow if they believed that the decision was coming from the President of the United States. Well, fascinatingly, on the morning of 9/11, the one person in the elected arm of government in Washington had been moved out of position. And this is very important because the man's training was, he was a fighter pilot with the Texas Air National Guard. And he would instantly, and I've discussed that with Field at some length, if he was looking at a radar screen or sitting in a war room where a war game exercise was going on, he would have seen very quickly as a simulated exercise of a hijacking began to go rogue with false radar inserts. So George Bush, and so the key there to the conspiracy is who put him there, was actually placed in an elementary school reading a goat story. Because from the conspirators' point of view, what they wanted to do was make George Bush look stupid. Now, there's a knee-jerk reaction amongst a certain community of Americans who are saying, because they've been programmed to say it, is, well, George Bush is stupid. Well, George Bush is not stupid. And I asked, I believe, a very important question to Field. I said, is anyone that you've ever known in your career as a fighter pilot who can handle these machines and survive, are they stupid or incompetent? And I have no reason to doubt. Field said to me, if you're stupid or incompetent, you're not going to be able to handle this plane. The follow-up question I gave to Field after that was, can you imagine putting Barack Obama in a fighter jet? He'd soiled his pants. You know, and I don't want to be read about Barack Obama, but if you look at his background, Kerry, there's nothing there. Now, so you've got George Bush, the commander-in-chief at an elementary school reading a goat story, albeit upside down, and that's another story. And where is the Joint Chief, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Henry Shelton? He's on a plane going to Europe. So the two people at the top of the flash override capability of the defense red switch network are off-seat, meaning that the command of the United States government was transferred down from the flash override to the flash network. And the flash network on 911 was operated by the British company Serco. Over to you.
Okay. Yeah, very, very interesting. And we can, of course, drill down to where it stands at this moment in this country. But I do want to give people a chance to ask their questions. So here I've got, can the Boeing uninterruptible autopilot be discovered by aircraft avionic technicians?
Yes. It's installed by, it's set up, it's calibrated, and it's tested by avionic technicians.
Okay. Does David think the plane is still at Diego Garcia?
Yes.
So you think the plane itself is still there, but the passengers may not be. In other words, you believe at least that the 20 employees of Freescale were flown to this place in China.
Yeah, I think they flew to Beijing. Maybe they even stayed at the Westin Hotel. Who knows? They might have met Michelle Obama, but that's kind of by the by. But my hypothesis would be, best evidence so far, is that the remaining passengers, some of them might have been selected. I still have some question marks about this guy Philip Wood and the iPhone in his rectum. But if I was in command of this exercise, I believe I would realize I've been subject to a double hijacking. That is to say, the original hijacking was to go take the passengers straight to Beijing, refuel the engine, kill the other passengers, take the Freescale off, and then dump it in the ocean north of Malaysia, and then say that the pilot had committed suicide. And then the public would have been quite happy if the body count had shown maybe a few of the bodies, but the fact that there were 20 Freescale people missing, that would be lost in the wash. But I believe Field's connection in the Marine Corps intelligence activity. They re-hijacked the plane when they discovered the conspiracy, and they brought the asset that was supposed to be destroyed right into the heart of the conspiracy, which is the British Indian Ocean territory, and parked it in the hangar, and then challenged the conspirators. Well, what are you going to do now? You see, they've got a huge problem. It's very difficult to dispose of a Boeing 777-200 in a convincing way if your original storyboard called for it being dumped north of Malaysia in the ocean. Now, notice the BBC immediately published a satellite image with some fuzzy little spots on it, and it's Canada BBC, and they gave that feed to the Chinese, who put it on their television, and the Chinese announced that debris consistent with the crash had been found north of Malaysia in the ocean. And then the BBC realized that they'd been finessed, withdrew that statement, and the Chinese followed very meekly immediately afterwards, saying, "Oh, we think we made a mistake. There are no coincidences."
Okay, well, that's interesting. This next question I think is appropriate, and it is also occurring to me. Aren't there far easier, safer ways, less expensive ways even, to abduct scientists and obtain wanted technology, patents, etc., rather than make an entire plane disappear, and so on? There's no doubt whatsoever that if they wanted the patents, it would seem there are other ways to bump these people off if that was what you wanted to do, disappear them, mind control them, etc., etc. And then this very public statement. Again, this gets back to the more kind of political positioning, jousting that this sort of reeks of, in my view.
Well, that's a very interesting question. There are, of course, other ways of doing it, but you see, it's most important, and that's why I strongly encourage people to look at certain episodes of the BBC program called Sherlock, where one of those episodes shows how Sherlock Holmes staged his own death. It's fascinating. Going back to British intelligence in the Second World War, there's a wonderful film, I think it's of the 50s or 60s, called The Man Who Never Was. Did you ever hear that film, Kerry?
Yes, but I don't remember it offhand.
Well, this is on the scale of what happened with MH370. The Churchill and his colleagues in British intelligence, they sometimes call themselves the Baker Street Irregulars, decided that since the Allies were going to invade through Sicily, they wanted to move a few German divisions over to Greece. So what they did is they found an individual who died of pneumonia, and apparently that ends up with water on the lung consistent with drowning. They put him in the uniform and they forged some papers that indicated this guy was a high-valued agent, British agent, carrying instructions to Allied forces to attack through Greece. And the body was put in a submarine and floated off the coast of Portugal. They checked the tides, and it floated ashore, and a British agent that was nominally working for the Germans found the body and took it to the Germans, and basically the Germans looked at the body, looked at the papers on the body, and they had to, the challenge, of course, was to determine whether this was a fake or not. The end result is 3 divisions, I think, now how many people is that? Maybe 30 or 40,000 men, predominantly were moved to Greece, and they stayed there for the rest of the war, waiting for the invasion that never came. So the great thinkers about military strategy always say war is deception. So whilst there are ways of getting hold of those patents, there are ways that might reveal the underlying conspiracy. And for example, the company that operates the United States Patent and Trademark Office, Kerry, is Serco. Right? So Serco would know which patents it wanted in order to transfer from Freescale in Austin, Texas, over the Tianjin plant with the appropriate technicians to reverse engineer it. So anything that Serco did that was too obvious would bring people to the stunning realization that the most senior patent lawyer ever to grace the White House, Hillary Clinton, probably arranged for Serco to take over the United States Patent Office, cherry-pick the patents, and transfer them to China with this subterfuge or camouflage that they hoped were the kidnapping of the 20-member team would be subsumed in a suicide that killed everyone on that plane.
Okay. Wild. It is very labyrinthian, but
It has to be.
yeah, I appreciate that. Okay, so let's see. I'm trying to see if someone here says there's no proof that Bush ever flew anything.
Well, no comment. I just people have to do their own research. You know, I'm not going to be bothered to do that. And,
Okay.
he was a member of the Texas Air National Guard. He was well reputed by his commanding officer. Field remembers or knows exactly what model plane, and it's an A version plane, meaning it's difficult to fly. The guy was a very capable pilot, and he's been demonized by, call it the hard left or the knee-jerk intellectuals. Over to you.
Okay. Well, at this moment, we seem to have we're kind of losing connection again, and then it looks like we're back. The part two, just so you know, part one and part two are now available, and they are on live stream. So the people that have missed pieces of this will be able to get everything, I believe, that we've done so far. What I'm going to do here is wrap this up, because again, we've been going for quite some time. I want to thank you, David Hawkins, for your excellent, presentation to us on all levels of your research and your team's research. I think that we've been very fortunate to have both you and Field McConnell out there doing this kind of investigative research and sharing it with the public. And this has been a great opportunity for us to follow your work. And so thank you so much for coming on the show here. This will again be put up on YouTube in its entirety, and I will get you guys the links so you can also put it embedded in your own pages so that people can get all of this. And with a bit of luck, all of it will be there. We won't have lost anything. In spite of all the crazy interruptions on the side of live stream, where the whole network supposedly was going down. So thank you so much. Any parting words here for the public, and maybe some words about, where you're going next with your research?
Well, I'd like to thank you, Kerry, because we don't often get such a professional, empathetic, and intelligent interview at the kind of level and technology that Field and I have to deal with every day. So I'm immensely grateful for that, and I'm sure Field would agree with me. Anytime you want either of us back, I think probably it's better one at a time, because two of us are pretty overwhelming. So we're very happy to come back, and I believe Field will be doing a tour of some of the victim countries that are being patsied into this bogus search procedure this month. And he'll have perhaps some shattering news to share with them and their leaders and with your listeners. Over to you.
Okay, excellent. Well, I look forward to following more of your work and getting the word out there, helping you guys inform the public and educate them as time goes on. You've got a great team over there, and we at Camelot appreciate all of it. So thank you again for taking the time. Everyone, thank you for listening. Thank you for hanging with us, the people that were with us on the live side. I'm sorry that this did end rather abruptly for the people that were there. But that's it's gone down once again, so we need to move along here. So thank you, and let's reconvene at a later date when there's more to be said.
Thank you very much, Kerry. Goodbye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Kerry.
Hi there. We are having some technical difficulties. I believe we're live right now, but people can't see or hear us at the moment because the entire live stream, which is this massive network, appears to be down.
It's a compliment, I think, that when you and I talk, they probably get very wired, Kerry.
I would imagine, but this would really be overkill. I mean, I've had all kinds of difficulties in the past, but this will be a first time we took down the entire live stream network.
Okay, we can hear both of you. Do the freaking interview.
Okay, well then, hi everyone. This is Carrie Cassidy from Project Camelot, and we are going live here. I don't know how exactly this is going to work out, but and what it tells me is that we are not live. However, we've got feedback that we are live, so we're going to go with that, and we'll record it at any rate. And may I ask that if anyone is seeing this, if they would also record it, and that way we can be sure that this will get out and be recorded in case something at my end isn't working right, which I'm not sure what's going on here. Okay. So at the moment, David, let's just bypass everything. Introduce yourself briefly with your background, if you would. And I know we kind of went through this the first day with when you were not able to be on Skype simultaneously. But let's try that, and then then we'll launch into various topics. Okay?
Yes, thank you. So, Kerry, my name is David Hawkins. I'm a 70-year-old guy, rapidly turning 71, which is by the by. I'm a graduate in mechanical engineering from Cambridge University back in the 1960s. And after leaving Cambridge with a degree in mechanical engineering and a diploma in industrial management, I joined a French oil field exploration company called Schlumberger, based out of Paris. And I had quite an exciting career, including being deployed from Paris, helping to put out oil fires, international troubleshooting. And my last job with Schlumberger was coordinator of artificial intelligence and geoscience research at the Schlumberger-Doll Research Center in Ridgefield in Connecticut, where I worked on advanced problem-solving techniques where computers emulated human beings. In 2006, I had a telephone conversation with Field McConnell, and I think instantly, and he can speak for that himself, we knew that we had not a marriage made in heaven, we're not that way inclined, but certainly a meeting of the minds, where a Top Gun fighter pilot with some 22,000 hours of experience in large jets and fighter aircraft, and a Marine and a very credible figure met with perhaps a rather eccentric Brit with some interesting ideas about forensic economics and crime scene analysis. And we probably had an average of an hour's conversation every day since December the 6th of 2006. And that has led to some very interesting legal opportunities, including Field filing a case in the North Dakota District Court against about 100 people for associated with the wrongful death of 911, and fast forward to the present, where he, as I understand it, and I don't know who his contacts are, other than I believe them to include senior people in the Marine Corps Intelligence Activity Command, believe he has recently received an invitation to appear as an expert witness at one or more of the countries involved in the phony search for the debris and the last ping from the black box of MH370. That's a very rapid summary, but that brings us up to the present. Kerry, over to you.
Okay. Well, very, very good summary indeed. At this moment, we have some new information that I posted to my website early this morning, and I believe you certainly would be aware of it, which is this letter from that went into the Malaysian press, from what I understand, came to me by way of Field McConnell, and it is talking about how this particular aircraft and everything that's going on with it could be very much another kind of a 911 incident, and why we have a training, what appears to be a training drill going on simultaneously with the disappearance of this airline. And that piece of information, I think, is new. I don't think anyone else has come forward to say there was a drill going on at the time this airline was disappearing.
I think you're right. It's certainly something that Field and I have been talking about right through 9/11 and the 7/7 underground bombing, where they use these phony drills as camouflage for hits or kidnappings, based on the fact that everyone participating in the drill in good faith is accustomed to receiving orders down through a hierarchical structure, where if you disobey the orders on BBC about the events of that day, and it's around 5 o'clock in the afternoon of September the 11th, 2001, and she's reading a script. Actually, the more vulgar term for those kind of talking heads is they're script kiddies. That is, they have no independent volition or understanding of what they're reading. They're just being taught to read it in a way that sounds vaguely convincing to the sheeple. And so Jane Stanley reads the script, which goes something along the lines, we are getting news that the Salomon Smith Barney building has collapsed, and that is number 7. And unfortunately for her, over her left shoulder, you can see the building still standing. So the demolition team timing, and this is a vitally important part of the aspect, and the generation of the script for the script kiddies got out of synchronization. And she read a piece of script that really applied to something that was going to happen about 20 minutes later. And of course, the people watching this and watching the reaction of the audience to this extraordinary attack from a long-bearded wonder on a dialysis machine in a cave in Afghanistan with a couple of walkie-talkies, this obviously would reduce the credibility that the world's greatest military power should be brought to its knees by such a character. So they unplugged the feed. And then, of course, the BBC went through multiple gyrations to explain how this was a simple error. But that's exactly the same kind of error that took place in the communications, the real-time communications from the crime scene of MH370, and is associated, I believe, with what is technically called a limited hangout by Sarah Bajk. Now, what is this limited hangout? And this is just a hypothesis, relating to the boyfriend, Philip Woods, and Sarah Bajk being interviewed on BBC. Well, the story from the Philip Woods and Facebook side is that this guy has a cell phone and ends up, well, he doesn't know where he's ended up, but has a bag put over his head through Facebook, he claims, by American military personnel, where the only way he was able to communicate, and he didn't know where he was, and I don't know if he understood how he was communicating the coordinates of where he was, is taking I assume it would be an iPod rather than an iPad, out of his rectum. Now, I don't know what your sense of humor is like, Kerry, but I do find it bizarre that he should have secreted but who am I to judge? I'm not a biologist. Anyway, he takes the iPad or iPod out of his rectum and then texts in a message to Facebook, and apparently that technology generates the GPS coordinates of where he was. So the experts were able. I went back to the UK and started a software company for the international oil industry, and I was the founder. I hired the software people, and we ended up solving the data problem in the international oil industry. So all data moving between major oil companies runs on the software developed by my team. I experienced then just how savage international finances could be, because I ended up having that company and its intellectual property taken away from the original shareholders, laundered through the liquidator, and ending up with my previous employer, a company named Schlumberger, at the time when a director of Schlumberger was John Deutsch, the disgraced former director of the CIA, who was fired by Bill Clinton. And to be fired by Bill Clinton, you've got to be seriously evil, but I digress. After leaving Schlumberger and my own company in the UK, I came to British Columbia in '92. And within 3 weeks of arriving, I sensed I was in the most corrupt jurisdiction in the world, which might surprise a lot of British Columbians and Canadians. But it would appear that organized crime has got to the heart of government itself. And very interestingly, a company called McDonnell Detweiler, that I know very well, was given a contract by the United States Air Force to develop software for taking planes off their regular en route airways and clipping them into what are known as final approach procedures for Category 3C landings. Ostensibly, that was designed as an anti-hijacking technology, but I knew back then, and there was a press release of May the 3rd of 2001, that this would give the Canadian government and the investors in McDonnell Detweiler the ability to hijack aircraft electronically and provide them with a Category 3C landing, ostensibly to protect against physical hijacking of the cockpit. But in reality, of course, if you've got the bad guys operating the drag and drop interface, they can capture a plane remotely, as happened with MH370. So around December the 6th of 2006, I had been desperately trying to alert anyone who would listen to me of the dangers of what are known in the spy industry as man-in-the-middle attacks on the command structure of sovereign states, including America's. And then fortunately through an episode on September the 11th, I think it was 2000 and whatever, on Coast to Coast with an audience of 4 million, someone listening to me apparently knew someone that I should talk to in the United States that turned out to be Field McConnell. So around December the 6th or December the 7th, 2000, in the case of the military, of course, it's a mutiny, and so the punishment is extremely serious. What, unfortunately and tragically, many people in those kind of hierarchical organizations is they're not in a position to ask that famous or infamous question, quo warranto, by whose authority? So a senior officer in the drills going on in Thailand through this hijacking of the MH370, anyone receiving an order through the drill would assume that whatever they were told to do came from an authorized source, and they might very well unwittingly participate in what is one of the most interesting, in my opinions, kidnappings the world has ever seen. Over to you.
Okay, yes, that's part of it. The other part is that we also have another relatively recent development, which is this cell phone call with a picture that was black, but nonetheless appears to be traceable to Diego Garcia, which further substantiates the idea that they are kidnapped and that the plane was redirected and steered and landed in Diego Garcia. Whether it took off again, I think we don't know. Do you want to talk about that phone call?
Yes, absolutely. And it's a fascinating anatomical exercise because this gentleman, I think from memory, his name is Philip Woods. And he has a girlfriend by the name of Sarah Bajc. I don't know if the pronunciation is right, B-A-J-C. And somehow this woman pops up and gets an interview on BBC. So she's just one relative of one passenger allegedly on that plane. And I'm always interested when the BBC gets into the loop because I was a good friend of the former Director General of the BBC, Greg Dyke, who was Director General through 911 and the murder of Dr. Kelly. And Greg Dyke was an interesting fellow. I used to play tennis with him and I ate at his house. There was something there that always troubled me about him, was his hatred for Americans, which I couldn't put my finger on why. I mean, I'd worked with Americans and I'm very fond of the country and I believe it's the great beacon of light for the world, but unfortunately is well covered by a blanket of corruption as we face it today. But so when the BBC interviews people, it pays for conspiracy theorists to look very clearly at the greatest propaganda, entertainment, and news instrument the world has ever seen, which was founded in 1928. And so, setting aside that particular interview with Sarah Batchk, and I'll come to that in a minute, there's a famous, and it wouldn't be described as an interview, but there's a newsreader in New York on 911 by the name of Jane Stanley, and she's being interviewed by an anchor man back in the United Kingdom.